So hello and happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of Backyard Beekeeping Questions and Answers. This is episode number 129, and today is October the 8th. Outside, just a few moments ago, it was 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 27 Celsius, and now, just in the time it took me to fix up this hot chocolate, it dropped 3 degrees and the wind is picking up because we have heavy storms coming in. And that's not great. Anyway, this is called The Way to Bee, and I'm glad you're here either via YouTube or podcast at Podbean, also known as The Way to Bee. So we're going to get right into it today, and if you want to submit your own questions, please put them down in the comment section below, or go to fredsfinefowl.com or follow the links down in the video description, which is also where you're going to see a list of all the topics that we're going to cover today. And then Adam Holmes, many thanks to him, who pops in every single Friday or Saturday morning and does itemized time links for everything that we're going to talk about. So that'll be the pinned comment if Adam shows up for this one. But we thank him. Give him a thumbs up and tell him how great the service is that he does, all for free. This comes from Call Me Ishmael, which is the starting line of the book Moby Dick. I'm sure there might be other applications here, but that's an interesting screen name. It says here, fantastic info, but I have a question. Is there any downside to simply not using the plastic tub feeder and instead dropping honey, waxy honey, pollen patties into plastic dishes which set inside the feeder shim? The bees can fly up into it and have free roaming of the feeder room, which is populated with whatever daily, weekly stuff I put there. Okay, well, I don't recommend rotating through a bunch of materials up in the hive in the feeder shim, which is on top of your beehive. So there would be an inner cover, or the feeder shim can be an integrated part of the inner cover, which are my feeder shims, which now recently I've retired mostly because I'm using the insulated inner covers now. But either way, they have a central hole. Even in your inner cover on your beehive generally has a hole in it. And that's where we put a feeder on top. And these feeders are designed specifically for that. So here's an example. The reference is made to a plastic tub. So here's a little one that sits over the hole, which is in your inner cover or your feeder shim or whatever you're using. This is a smaller one. There's a larger rapid round version. And the question is, why can't we just put a plate up there and leave, for example, that hole open, and then just use the space to present whatever leftovers we have that we want the bees to clean up? I mean, it sounds like a great idea, because the bees then don't have to go to some kind of feeder station, robbing station, and interact with a bunch of other bees from a bunch of other hives, and they get the leftover honey and everything else. There are some concerns. Number one, bee space. So if we have a feeder shim that's a big open cavity directly over your inner cover and your bees have free access to it, there's nothing to stop them from moving right up in there, because that's actually going to be the warmer part of the hive. And especially here in North America, going into this time of year, they would be seeking the higher positions inside the hive where they can preserve their warmth. So they might actually start building comb in the space. So anything larger than bee space, which is 3/8 of an inch, the bees tend to build burr comb, cross comb, bridge comb, all this extra random honeycomb that doesn't follow the frames that we install in the boxes for them. So that's one concern. The other thing is, when we're putting honey up there, if anyone has ever set out a bucket of scrapings, because hopefully when you're inspecting your beehives, you're bringing your hive tools with you, and you're scraping off the burr comb on the tops of the backs of the different frames as you're pulling the boxes off, because then you need to be able to put them back in and not have them be pushed up or in the way or blocked by clumps of beeswax on top. So we're scraping it off, we're collecting it in buckets, and a lot of times that has honey in it too. So the bees come to it right away, like right now when the bees are robber crazy. Anytime you have exposed honey anywhere, they're after it. So it could cut down robbing if we hid that inside the hives. I get it. So an option might be to take off this inner cone, which prevents your bees from getting out on the free surface of your syrup that you might put in there. And then you put the outer cover on top of it, which would prevent the bees from, of course, getting up into the rest of the space. And we have a controlled column that they come up through, and then they access this space And you could let them get into some of the leftover honey and stuff like that, but there are other things to consider, and that is when there's a lot of honey, even heavy syrup, and they have free access to it. If there's a lot of surface area, honeybees tend to get stuck in it, they get bogged down, and they tend to die in it. So for those who are trying to keep their bees from dying, where even 1 or 2 bees can cause a sensation and make you feel like you're a terrible beekeeper, then having them have free access to open surface honey and heavy syrups and things like that is potentially going to take out the bees themselves. They get too bogged down in it. So I recommend that we use these feeders for 2 things, because the other thing that's mentioned here is pollen patties as well. Pollen patties are designed to go straight on the frames themselves, and that is so that bees have access to all edges of the pollen patty, top, bottom. They're laying on the frames. Usually it's going to be the brood area because that's where they need the pollen, and so those are down below. Generally, you wouldn't want to break that up and just provide it up in the space, because the other thing is when you have the inner cover, I'm just going to use this one as an example. If this were your inner cover, the hole is in the center, so now the food resources that you're putting up here would have to be around these edges so you don't just block the hole. So you would be laying pollen patties and things up here, and as I mentioned before, if the bees don't come up here and they don't use that resource, now you've got pollen patties up here. What might get up there and make use of your pollen patties? Depending on where you live, small hive beetle larvae could start having a field day up there. So you can end up with pests too. So I recommend syrup or dry feed, and I recommend using actual feeders that are designed for that rather than just spreading it around up in there. And I mean, it seems convenient, but you also have to clean that off later. It's not just going to be able to stay up there. And if there's a bunch of wax cappings and things like that, they might start building other infrastructure up there that you don't want, because it is a feeder space that we need to be able to block off at different times of year. So I hope that is helpful. The grafting tool's making noise over there. So that's the first question. Question number 2. Rena Hugo. And this is not so much a question but a statement, but I thought I would respond to it because it says, "It is known that open feeding stations of all kinds are a perfect place for your mite-free bees to pick up new mites to infest your treated colonies. Is it worth it in the long run?" with 4 question marks after that. So now I have a question about that, and because I'm doing my own backyard studies, I'm always doing some kind of study and observation, but I did some interesting things over the past week. One was, and this regards open feeding. So I'm going to answer this question, but I'm also going to tell you some other awarenesses that I suddenly had because I decided to let bees come to an open feeding tanker and until I got them all congregated there, because what I want to know is if we're doing open feeding, and a lot of beekeepers do it, by the way. A lot of commercial beekeepers put out huge 50-gallon drums of syrup. There's these huge investments in putting feed out, and this is the time of year that they're doing it, so it's timely. Good question to make, or a good comment. Because are you feeding your own bees? Now, where I live here in the state of Pennsylvania, I live on a dirt road in a rural area, but guess what? There's a bunch of beekeepers around me. There's beekeepers to the east, to the south, to the north, and to the west. At a recent beekeeper breakfast I was at, one of the fellow beekeeper members there came up to me and said, "Yeah, you know, my bees are just up the road and they're within foraging range of your property." So it got me thinking, if I put out feed, how do we even know where the bees are going? I mean, when we put out a fresh source of feed, we sit there and we watch it. And that's what I use feeding stations for primarily, is observation of the bees that are coming to it, as well as the wasps and hornets, for example. European hornets, yellow jacket wasps, and I like to see what's in the area. But I decided, and I've thought about this for a long time anyway, so I decided this time I'm going to take some powdered sugar, because this is how I find out who's robbing a colony, for example. Why not do this at an open feeding station? I sprinkle powdered sugar all over the backs of the bees once they're all congregated there and they can't get out of the way. So I dust them all up like a bunch of sugar donuts, and then they get upset and they fly away. And you can see the video of that because some of the bees groomed themselves off and they used the powdered sugar and they made little pollen balls on their hind legs and took those back with them. So what this does is When we dump a bunch of powdered sugar on the bees and sprinkle it, don't like give it clumps, like use a sugar shaker, or you can use your Sugar Shake Mite jar that's got the number 8 screen on the top of it. Fill that thing with powdered sugar, and then when the bees are all there and they can't move, you really quickly dump it all over all of them, and they go flying in all directions. A couple of things happened. I could see them really clearly when they were taking off and trying to get oriented. Some of them came right back down and continued feeding, even with sugar all over them. Others took off and they did their semi-orientation flight, and then they beelined it away. A very tiny number of those bees were going to my own beehives. So it occurred to me, if I go to the landing boards now and the sugar-dusted bees, because I have an apiary that's small enough, on a commercial scale this would be very difficult to do, but we're backyard beekeepers, so we can see what's going on in our landing boards, and we can see them all in a short period of time. And they really stand out when they have white powdered sugar on their hairs. So you can see the ones that come in and land on your landing boards, and then what I learned was the bulk of the bees that are coming to that open feeding station are not my bees. So I'm feeding someone else's bees. The other part of that, and this is what this comment is about, you're getting all your bees to congregate together at these feeding stations, and they are shoulder to shoulder and often layered on top of each other. If you've ever, this time of year, when the foragers are large in number, the resources are few, wherever there's any kind of nectar source, they're all over it, and there's no courtesy. They're just dogpiling in there, and they push out all the wasps even. So the honeybees are number one at the feeding stations. But then they're all flying off, and it was really conspicuous. A lot of them were flying straight over the cornfield directly south of me. And so if I knew the other beekeepers and I could give them a call and say, hey, are you guys seeing white powdered sugar bees landing on your landing board? And for all you know, I mean, because they might be panicked because they see white powdered sugar on their bees and they don't understand what that white substance is. So they don't know what's going on. So you could be sending them out in all these directions. So then I moved the feeding station to another location and got it well away from my apiary. It was obvious that, 90% of the feed, and again, this is a very crude observation. This is not solid science where I had done this hundreds of times in a bunch of areas and everything else. This is just me looking at stuff and wondering what's going on. So now I went 150 yards to the east and I set up another feeding station. And then I did the same thing. Now this is what was interesting too. I could really see what direction they were coming from and going to, and none of them were coming from my apiary. So that was interesting. But I had this question. Wow, I wonder if those bees are bringing mites with them. Because again, now I'm feeding frames of honey. The better comb frames that I'm pulling out. Not to get rid of them, but these are the ones that had the toothpicks in them, so I'm not going to reuse them, and I can't run them through an extractor because they fall apart and all this other stuff. So I decided I'm going to use these for my testing. So I brought them out there in Hive Butler totes, and I put them out on my little rack, and I made videos of it too. So once they were on there, and again, we had shoulder-to-shoulder bees, I powder sugared all those bees and watched them take off, and I was suspicious again because they did not go back to my thing. So then the other thing occurred to me, wow, I've got my whole mite counting powdered sugar shaker and my collection system and everything all there. So I decided, why don't you just scoop up jars of these bees, dump powdered sugar on them, give them the old 2-minute dwell time with the powdered sugar all over them, give them the 1-minute shake sequence after that, shake out all the powdered sugar into my little colander that's lined with a very large coffee filter. And then once I shake out all that sugar onto that, I can spray it down with fresh water and rinse out the sugar and see if I have Varroa destructor parasitic mites on the backs of these foraging bees. So, and I videoed it because I thought this is going to be really interesting. What if they are flying around with phoretic mites, mites that are on top of the backs of bees, and they're just all over and shoulder to shoulder, and therefore they're passing on the mites to one another. So I did that. I did one cycle and no mites. So I waited for them all to congregate again, build up again, did another cycle an hour later, and no mites. Then I thought, well, I need to get more of them in the jar. So, instead of 300 bees, which is half a cup, And you get them in the jar, they're so mad anyway. These are foragers. These aren't nurse bees that you took off of a frame. So now I got as many as I could in my last jar last night and shook those out. No mice. So we're repeating the test today, but now the storms are coming in. It's going to end it for me. So I did several cycles of this, and I could not get a single Varroa destructor mite off any of the foraging bees. So this comment here, it is known that open feeding stations of all kinds are a perfect place for your mite-free bees to pick up new mite-infested, and they would get into your treated colonies. So now it's no question that we put our bees at risk at open feeding stations because pathogens can be passed to one another just through physical contact. But what I have not been able to find is a single mite out of hundreds, thousands now of foraging bees tested at a feeding station, what we would also call a robbing station because we use it for cleanup and things like that. So they could pass on pathogens, but what I'm comforted to know is that none of my bees are passing on live adult mites from thorax to thorax, body to body, and things like that. So you'd have to ask yourself, first of all, let's say the mites were on the bees, and we should have gotten at least a mite somewhere in there. But if they're already on the bees, they're attached to that foraging bee, and the mite is feeding on that bee. What is the incentive for the mite to leave the abdomen of the forager that it's currently on and migrate onto the abdomen or any part of the body of another bee from another colony at a feeding station? That mite doesn't want to let go because if it lets go, it's in jeopardy. It has to travel to another bee. Now I know, for example, Dr. Seeley has done videos where they showed how agile Varroa destructor mites are, and for their controlled observation, they took a mite and they put it on a flower. Now that mite was taken off of the bee. It did not voluntarily leave the body of the bee. So the mite was clamming around the flower, and then another bee comes and lands on the flower, and then the mite clambered onto that bee because that mite has no host. But it didn't voluntarily leave the bee. So to show the agility of the mite, do they have the ability to move like that? Sure they do. Would they have the desire to do that? Well, I don't think they do, because unless the host that they're on is dying or in some way no longer providing the resources that the mite needs, because what's the mite's goal? To stay on that worker, to get into some bee's brood area, so it's going to go back to its own hive, it's going to go into the brood area, and ultimately it's going to get under cappings before the pupae are capped at just the last moment before that happens, and then they hope to reproduce. That is the full intent of the Varroa destructor mite. Gain resources from the bodies of bees, usually nurse bees, not the older foragers, unless this hive is really collapsing, and then they want to get in there and reproduce on pupating bees. So this very fundamental test for me satisfied me that they are not transferring mites around from one another through shoulder-to-shoulder feeding at a feeder. So my question is, has anyone actually seen this happen, or has there been a test that's happened that you know about that proves? Because when people start off with, it is known. So then if it's known, then there must be a study, there must be some way that we can prove that. So that's why I do this practical testing. I invite you to do a couple of things at your own apiary. So if you're already in the habit of open feeding, I'm not telling people to go and open feed. If you're already doing it and you've got a small apiary, get out there with your powdered sugar and sprinkle it all over those bees 2 or 3 in the afternoon when the activity is at its max. And you can see them fly because that white powdered sugar is conspicuous. Those bees fly out, and I really doused a bald-faced hornet with sugar, and that hornet corkscrewed up and up and up and up and seemed to not even know where it could go after that. I didn't understand what that wasp was doing. But anyway, the honeybees were very clear, and you'll be able to see. It's a great experiment to do with kids and stuff. If you've got kids that are learning and you want to teach them to get answers through practical, small-scale, crude experiments, that we have an idea, we have a way to test it, and then we want to see what happens in the end and draw our conclusions. And then, of course, the best part of science is it has to be repeatable. So I'd also like to know where those tests have been done. So anyway, that's what I did. And I posted a video about that, the first test I did in the series, and I'm going to continue to do it, by the way, because it doesn't kill the bees. So you can just do it, just to see periodically what's going on. So somebody to the east of me was getting a lot of sugar syrup, and somebody over the cornfield, which is to the south of me, is also stealing stuff. So these are also the bees that are probably coming in and robbing. So that was the other part of the test. And why do the sugar shake anyway? If you have a colony that's being attacked full on by another hive of bees, or several hives might be converging on it, because right now you do an inspection of any kind, you put the scent of honey in the air and you get robbers immediately. So they already had to be in the vicinity. So if they're dogpiling one of your hives on the landing board and this big fight's going on, one of the things that happens when you dump sugar all over them is they clear out. So all these sugar covered bees, they all disperse right away. Now they're going to come back. So that gives you an opportunity to put powdered sugar on everybody. And then when they clear out, now you put that robbing screen on there. Like one of the Bee Smart design robbing screens like this time of year, you better have these handy. There isn't time to go and get one. So I'm going to talk about this more at the very end, because we need to make sure that you're closing down your entrances because robbing is at its peak. But now you can see, are they just going to another one of your hives? Usually a nice strong colony. So if those sugar-covered bees are leaving your apiary and going somewhere else entirely, you're being robbed out by somebody else's bees. And we don't want that. We don't want to help those bees take over our stuff. Anyway, number 3. Horizontal bees is the name of this person. We're getting ready to start storing equipment here in the mountains of North Carolina, and was watching your last video with the wraparound feeders. I think I mispronounced this, or I don't come through clearly. They're rapid round feeders. So they're just round feeders, and they're called rapid because they're easy to fill up really quick and everything else. So have you found any way to clean the wax and propolis off the feeders to store them for winter? I thought about using my wife's dishwasher, but concluded that was an unwise decision. LOL. Any advice would be helpful. Okay, so here's the thing. Yeah, these things are inexpensive. The source, Apis, is the seller on Amazon right now, and people keep telling me that they're out of stock. So I hope they get back in stock soon, because theirs are really good ones. But when it comes to these feeders, this one's dirty. Notice, it's got propolis and stuff in it, because I use them over and over. And by the way, note that there's propolis on the top edge of that center cone. Should I scrape that off and remove it? I say no, and here's why. I leave the wax that they build up in there. Some of these have, you look at the underside, and they put propolis in there, and some of them will actually build a wax-like staircase up through there of honeycomb. So I leave it, and the other thing is I don't transfer these from hive to hive. These are dedicated to specific single hives. So it's hive number 22, the feeder is number 22. And even when you take it off and you're rotating them, because I recommend that you keep a lot of these so that you have time to disinfect them and things like that, you can soak them in a 10% bleach solution. So I fill up 5-gallon buckets, and I take them all apart, and I put all the lids in one, and I put all the bases in another, and then you can put all the clear ones in another and identify them for the hives that you took them out of. But after the bleach solution, you could consider those sanitized. And so then you can mix them up. But I like to keep them in the same configurations just for tracking and everything else, to see how long they last and so on. Anyway, the 10% bleach solution is good enough. And then if you want to get rid of, there's like a lot of wax buildup and it's like getting in the way, or it's making it hard for you to position it, or you're going to change them to other hives, I take a heat gun. And the heat guns are, the ones that plug in for me are the best. I know there's new battery powered fancy ones out there. The plug-in ones are cheaper, and they run hot. Like you can crank them up 400, 500 degrees if you need to. But all you need to do is get the temperature up above wax melting or propolis melting temperature. The other thing is you can take 100% cotton rags if you have them, or you can use paper towels, and you put the paper towel right over, let's say this had wax on it, you lay the paper towel right on the wax, You hit that with a heat gun and get it above the melting temperature of the wax, and the paper towel absorbs the wax right into it, and then you can give it a quick wipe out, and now you've got your wax out of there too, and it's controlled. It's in the paper towel. So heat guns, wax. I'm not sure if a hair dryer gets hot enough, but a heat gun is a cool thing to have anyway, because you can also use that inside your hive boxes, because this time of year, hopefully, we're packing down our hives, pulling off supers, we're getting the frames out, separating the frames from the boxes so that you can refurbish your boxes and get them ready for the spring. And heat guns are just a great way to soften it all up, and then use your scrapers to scrape all that out. And then you have nice smooth areas, nice smooth shoulders for your frames to go in, and everything else. So this also works on your wrapped around feeders. Of course, you don't want to heat it up so much that the plastic deforms or melts. But that's what I do. So the 10% bleach solution, obvious dirt and stuff, get that out of there. And that's all you need to do. And I don't feel it's necessary to remove the wax, because I think leaving wax residue in there actually helps them get their footing. And after all, they built it themselves. So some of them are closing up that center cone area, and it also reduces the amount of airflow through there, but the lid keeps the air contained anyway, unless you have one of these yellow ones. These things have holes in the lid. I don't use it. I got one of these, and it has holes in the inner cone as well. So I just got these because I wanted to see how they're made, and the venting and stuff. And I also wanted this really clear plastic piece too. I highly suspect that if the bees were left to themselves, they would plug up these little holes, because we don't want air leaking out in the wintertime through this, through the top, and out of the hive. Although I just noticed something looking at this. The top of this plastic piece is level with the top of that. I just learned this right now, right here while I'm doing this. And then see how they have the same number of holes here. You have an option with this. Look at it. Now I can line up these holes, and there is a vented leak path. Once you do that, so you can line them up like that. But if I turn it and misalign the holes, it's laying flat on that inner plastic. So we did close off the venting. The things you learn looking at stuff. So you have an option with that thing to vent it or not. I like that thing even more now. If only they made it in the half-gallon size. So they don't. Here I am on the spot learning stuff. Okay, moving on. Number 4. This one comes from M. So say hello to 007 for me there. It is not really timely for autumn issues, but has me wondering, in our never ever fight against mite numbers, I have heard that brood breaks help. I know this can be achieved when performing colony splits, which that's not as good as I used to think it was. I have also heard that some people temporarily confine their queen so as to create a brood break. And in previous Friday Q&A sessions, we've talked about queen cages, where you could stick it over the queen and keep her on the frame. I think Brad Oliphant asked about that, and some others. I've also heard that some people temporarily confine their queen so as to create a brood break. My question is regarding the queen confinement. What are the pros and cons? If done, how long should she be paused in laying to achieve a brood break that helps reduce the mites, yet not be too detrimental to the colony? So I have an answer for this. So I have a good idea. Well, in my opinion, a good idea for me. By the way, when I talk about ideas like this is my own idea. This is something I'm going to do, and I'm going to practice. I'm going to try it out. It might not be awesome, but it's all tied in with honeybee biology and theory and things that I think should work. And let me explain why this is so. I don't like the trapping the queen on the little, on the brood frame, sticking a number 8 hardware cloth or whatever on there, and then they feed her through the little holes and stuff like that. Now, she supposedly can continue to lay in there, but the nurse bees can't get in to feed her. So these queen traps need to be sized like a queen excluder so nurse bees can get in there too. But then I was thinking about this brood cycle thing, because this is what some people who are completely natural beekeepers, no treatments, like to try to do. So we know that the Varroa destructor mite needs to reproduce inside or under the cappings of their choice is going to be drones, which are the males, because they're in there the longest, and they're big and they're fat and they have lots of resources for reproduction. So they can actually get 2 reproduction cycles in there. So you get what's called a foundress, varroa mite that's going to produce a male and then going to produce a female, and then they just double their numbers because she's also going to come out. So the one that laid the eggs that produced the new offspring, they both come out. So we just double them, right? So this whole idea of there's a complicated one that requires you to get in there and rotate the queen onto now a different comb and swap that one, put her on a new comb and swap that one, and so forth and so on. So this got me thinking. I was looking into queen cages, so I found something, and I bought them, by the way. So this is a queen, what's it called? Queen confinement cage. I'm going to share my idea, but I want to show you the piece of gear. This is what I showed in the cover shot for today's video. This is the cage. This thing is designed to sit in a deep box. It also sits on the edges just like the ears of your frame of drawn comb. It could even be frame of brood if you want it to be. So you put that inside of this thing. Now this goes inside the hive, and you have 2 choices. You're going to push this up against the outside wall of your hive, which for me would be the eastern side or the southern side of the hive, because my bees tend to run their brood in that direction anyway. It gets early warmth in the day and so on. So you end up confining your queen to one side of one deep frame. And it's a queen excluder size, so the queen actually gets attended to by the nurse bees, and she has a whole frame. So she has over 3,000 cells available to her to continue to produce her offspring. So let's assume this is a 10-frame box. So maybe you want to see it in a 10-frame box. Oh look, I just happen to have one here. This is how it looks in the box. So it would be off to the side. There's the queen on her frame in the queen, and this is what it looks like from underneath. So if you're thinking, well, she could just get out from underneath, no, she can't, because it wraps around all sides except for the back side of that frame. You can also make a follower board, it's called, and trap the queen in the center of your hive if you're set that that's exactly where she has to be. Maybe you've got a horizontal hive configuration, something like that. Then this would cover the deep frame with the queen on it with drawn comb and everything that she needs. And then of course you would put that up against a solid barrier like a follower board or a divider board, and then the worker bees can get up over the top and access frames on both sides. Keep her warm and alive. Okay, now here's my thinking. And by the way, if you're looking for one of those, they're from Blue Sky Bee Supply. So if you're going to look it up and you're going to try it, I have nothing to do with these people, but tell them Frederick Dunn sent you anyway so that you can pay the same as everyone else does. And let me tell you, that's going to be $19 even for that. So how does it work? Well, let's look at this. So now we put the queen on the one frame, and she's going to continue to lay her eggs, and they're going to hatch, and they're going to do all that stuff. But if it's a clean frame of drawn comb, like Better Comb, for example, or you've just got a frame that's got drawn comb, and the reason is we want everything on that frame to start at the same time. So we know that once the queen starts laying eggs there, those eggs are going to hatch in 3 days. After 3 days, they're going to be fed by the nurse bees over here. Now what's going on in the rest of the 9 frames? All these frames are going to be finishing out their cycles. And this got me thinking, because when people are doing oxalic acid vaporization, all this discussion has come up. You need to do it 5 times, 5 days apart, and you need to keep doing it until your mite numbers are gone. So now we have an opportunity here to do the entire thing, because if you do 5 treatments and you do it every 5 days, that's 25 days that you've done treatments of oxalic acid. Plus you did those treatments 5 times over, and you're harassing your bees with oxalic acid vaporization, which, by the way, I use oxalic acid vaporization if I have high mite counts. So this is why this occurred to me, and this is why this is valuable. So this is what I plan to do. I'm going to confine the queen to one of those. I'm going to let all the other frames run through their complete cycle. So then once there's no more open larvae, because they will all matured, and then they get capped on their 9th day, and then they go until their 21st day. So from the 9th to the 21st day, then they're all going to hatch out again. Right now we have a bunch of open stuff and no new eggs, no new larvae by the 21st day. Now it could happen sooner than that, because you can do your inspections and see, oh, there's no capped larvae anywhere. So now what can we do? Right? We can't leave the queen in here and let her new progeny hatch out. So in less than 21 days, we're going to pull the frame that the queen's on. That's right. We're just going to get rid of it. We're going to put them in the freezer. We're going to kill them. That's right. We're killing the babies underneath the cappings. If you want to do it in a single treatment, because that's where we're headed with this, right? So she's in the brood box, she's on the brood frame, and all these others, I know you're following me already with this. They've already hatched out, so there's no more capped larvae there. We're going to remove her before the 21st day. Her frame is gone. She can start laying if she wants out here, probably even before that. But as soon as all the things are uncapped, now oxalic acid vaporization has its most effective environment, and that's because all the mites are exposed, all the mites are phoretic, and you get to hit them all at once. And you'll have more than 90% efficacy based on the studies that have been done. So you could, hit them another, if you wanted, 5 days after that, just do the counts and see how effective that is. But I think for the backyard beekeeper who's not production minded, because keep in mind now it's about getting those varroa mites, keeping the colony queen right. Her pheromone's still there. She's still laying. She's doing everything. As far as they know, everything is great. They're just not getting the numbers that they normally would. You're going to lose thousands of bees that otherwise would have been produced during that cycle because she's going to lay 1,700 eggs a day or whatever. You got maybe 3,500 cells on that frame that she could lay in and start making her babies, but we're going to kill those babies because check this out. Once those other frames no longer have capped larvae for the mites to reproduce in, where are they headed? They're going to be headed for this frame that the queen's on because her stuff is still being capped 9 days after she's been in there and sometimes longer because she's not going to fill all those cells in the first 9 days. So we're going to have a cascade of desperate mites going into that last frame to get under those cappings before they're capped, and we're going to pull them all out before any of them can hatch. How does it sound to you? What are your thoughts on that? And these are oxalic acid vaporization treatment. In a single treatment, it will be just like treating during a brood break at the end of November, beginning of December, which is when we have the greatest effectiveness with oxalic acid vaporization. So what do you think about that? I think that's a very interesting way to go and knock those mites down. And here's the thing. Here's why I don't think this is such a huge loss to the backyard beekeeper. The thing is, your bees are constantly harassed by the varroa mites. So remember, you're only doing this because your mite numbers were too high to begin with. So your bees are going to be sick to some degree. They could just not be living as long as they otherwise would. They may not be as productive as they otherwise would. Maybe they don't fly as far as they otherwise would in the absence of the varroa destructor mites, which would be bothering them. So now we got an entire colony free of mites for now. And if you only own 3 or 4 colonies in your backyard apiary, because remember, we're backyard beekeepers, we can do very involved things if we want to, if it's going to benefit the bees. So what if you did all 4 of them at once? What if you put one of those things in all 4 of your colonies? Now we cut down on drift colony to colony, but I question whether or not the drift of bees is actually bringing the varroa mites to one another unless one of those colonies is collapsing with disease and varroa mites. That's when the mites jump on the backs and they leave with them. So if we did them all, we could actually take our own apiary right down and get those mites under control before nectar flow. Because here's the thing too that I consider. I catch swarms sometimes, of course my own swarms. This year we recycled swarms right into the apiary that came from our own hives, and we did walk-away splits and things like that. They rebound extremely fast. So one of the mentions here is the natural rhythm. When they produce a new queen and they make there's a break in brood during that period, but the break is not always significant. And this is why when I looked at some of my other hives, including that horizontal long Langstroth hive, and the mite numbers in there were so high, but the brood was concentrated, and of course they had sac brood disease in there. So there were other things affecting and afflicting those bees in that hive. But if you get a healthy swarm and you put them in a box on their own, some of those swarms filled a 10 frame deep completely and filled and capped a complete medium super since August or the first week of September, because their brood break is significant. So when it comes to a static hive that just supersedes a queen, the brood break may not be significant, because that's what occurred to me with the long lang hive. Why wasn't the brood break enough to help knock down those Varroa destructor mites? Well, because they may have produced a replacement queen while the current queen is still in the hive, which is the norm. And before that queen flies out and swarms with the others, she's within days of the new virgin queen hatching out. Therefore, she's already been in lay, sometimes within just a few days before she departs the colony, which means she's producing eggs. So the brood break might only be a couple of weeks total. Well, the phoretic mites running around inside that hive are still alive. Just because they can't reproduce doesn't mean that you've taken care of them, because those numbers now are static. They're not increasing. And of course, they're hanging out on the nurse bee frames. And as those nurse areas, as the brood becomes smaller and smaller, as we enter the end of the year, more mites are concentrating themselves there. And that's why we have such a problem. So the brood break might not have been significant to arrest mite development, not reduce mite development. Unless you've got a stock of bees that actively grooms mites and gets rid of them through a screen bottom board onto some kind of sticky board that you've sprayed with PAM cooking spray or something like that, you're not really reducing mite numbers. But with this method of trapping a queen, you're going to have 100% open mites with nowhere to hide from the oxalic acid vaporization. And you're going to hit them and they're going to die. So they will die, trust me. So if you do this, let me know how it worked for you. Because a lot of people, by the way, that watch this are coming into spring and summer down in Australia. So the rest of us are buttoning up for winter. Other people are starting their year. It would be a great way. Oh yeah, why am I even talking about Australia? I take it back. They don't have Varroa destructor mites. So those of you who are in the South, that might still be able to use something like that. Try it out and see how it goes. You'll way more than recover the cost of a $19 thing from Blue Sky Bee Supply, which I have no connection with. Next question, number 5. This comes from Francine. Speaking of Australia, this is in New South Wales. Just got my first nuke, 25/9/21, so September 25th, and used the Rapid Round feeder and the sock with the 1-to-1 sugar syrup. They're on their second refill this morning. I checked them, and on top of the sock there, they have been drinking, it looks like, little tiny black dots. Could this be mold? Have you had this happen? Yes, I have. The sock has been working like a charm otherwise. Thanks again for the education. You're welcome. Thanks for watching. Here's the thing. So the sock thing, if you want to sanitize your drinkers, and that's why we're going to talk about some other drinkers here too. But even these drinkers, see how complex this is? So how do you clean the inside of that? You can put syrup in there that has bleach in it. That's right. Scientific Beekeeping with Randy Oliver discusses the 1 teaspoon per gallon of sugar syrup for bleach. It also works to make your little sock ankles nice and white. So it will kill that bacteria, keep mold from growing, extend the life of your sugar syrup, make it smell like a swimming pool, which a lot of bees go to anyway. They just love swimming pools. And there's no long-term studies on exposure to bleach and sugar syrup and things like that. But most of us are not feeding sugar syrup throughout the year, at least I hope we're not. By the time your honey supers are on and things like that and things are going well, we're not feeding anyway. But if you want to sanitize your feeders, your drinkers, at the same time you're feeding them sugar syrup and extending the life of the syrup, that 1 teaspoon per gallon of sugar syrup works really well. Another thing, I have thymol here, but thyme oil. So thyme oil is another extender that will help keep mold from growing. Also, a lot of the essential oils like Pro Health, Honeybee Healthy, things like that can be added to your sugar syrup, which extend the life of it. They also put a scent into the air. Bleach is a sanitizer for sure, though. Next, we get a question number 6, which is Adele Watkins. I'm hoping that you could do a video to speak about CBPV. I'm very new to beekeeping, and I can't find any good info to get some education on this. Can you point me in the right direction? Well, first of all, CBPV is chronic bee paralysis virus. And it's one of the things we do when we're kind of teaching people to look at their beehives and see what the health of the bees are, landing board observations and things like that. Because if your bees are suffering from chronic bee paralysis, there are a lot of conspicuous tells. And this is when you see your bees on the ground in front of the hive, and I'm not talking one or two bees moping around. The bees start to pile up in dead piles in front of the hive, and they tremble a lot, and they walk in circles, and they seem disoriented. And so I did look into this to see how prevalent it is. First of all, 18% of U.S. hives tested have some level of chronic bee paralysis virus present. 0.7% are prevalent to the point where you're actually seeing symptoms outside the hive. So when you're looking at your bees outside your hives in the morning, this time of year, what would we see outside the hives on the ground, dead and dying? Drones. So that's natural. You should not panic when you see 20 or 30 drones being given the boot right now. They're not very nice to them, by the way, when they're dragging them out. They're biting their toes. In some cases, when the drone keeps turning around trying to go back in, I've watched worker bees sting them to death. They bite at their wings, they kick them out, they're not friendly about it. And honeybees have a hard time flying away with drones because they're just too big and too heavy. So if you see a bunch of dead drones, their eyes come together at the top of their heads, it's the obvious, the male bee is being cast off, they don't need them, and that would not necessarily indicate this. But the worker bees that can't fly, they're paralyzed. The good news is that when they're sick like that and they can't fly and this paralysis is set in to where it's symptomatic, they can't fly to other hives. So that's good news. The other thing is they're working on treatments for this, and there isn't any across the board treatment because the next thing, what if you get it? What do you do about it? Well, that hive is pretty much doomed. If you have hundreds of bees and they die in clumps in front, they die in clumps on the landing board. So they're barely making it out the door. And it looks a lot sometimes like an acute exposure to some kind of pesticide. Unless you look for the secondary symptoms, you see the ones that are moving in circles. That's pretty much it. Call in your bee mentor. You can call your inspector if you have a state inspection program, so you can look at it and verify that it is this paralysis virus that's going around. And then you might want to get rid of the hive and all the equipment. When it talks about the equipment, I mean like all the frames and stuff. There's no reason to swap those frames out and move them into other hives. You know, cut the comb out if it's natural foundation, and just make sure to deal with everything. And of course, this is another reason why I always tell people to clean your hive tools, sanitize them disinfect between every hive that you go to. And they're so inexpensive, especially these flat ones, like this hive tool right here. There's no reason you can't just have that laying in there on your inner cover. And that's because when you go into that hive, the outer cover pulls off easy, and then you need your hive tool to open up the covers and boxes below that, the inner cover and so on. And so if you have tools that are dedicated to each hive, then we're not spreading potential viruses from one hive to the next. The other way that they're spread, of course, is through bee drift. So regular foragers are going to other hives and things like that. But chronic bee paralysis, one of the ways you can look up studies on it, but you won't find a lot of feeling good about it when it comes to, well, if I have it, what do I do about it? And so there's no treatment right now. There's no regimen for it. But you want to make sure and just control the spread of contamination. And of course, those bees, they're going to rapidly decline because bees that suffer from that are dead within 5 to 7 days anyway. So you're going to see an immediate kind of collapse of the whole colony. So you're going to be cleaning that up, and just be very careful about how you manage the dead bees from the colony, the equipment in the colony, and of course you can flame the interior surfaces of the boxes and things like that. But I would personally, people get mad at me when I say this, but I would get rid of the frames and the comb. That's me. If they're all wood and they're wax combs, then I would use them to start my campfire, my bonfire this time of year. Go to question number 7 now. This is from Sage and Stone Homestead. Can you feed back honey to your hive in winter? They're in southern Kentucky by using an inverted mason jar or a Bee Smart 3-season feeder. Would the honey need diluting to flow? Okay, so the first thing is I'm going to talk about the economics. Even though we're backyard beekeepers and we're not in it for the money or whatever, some people are sidelining and earning some money from their honey. But I want to talk about several things here. One, don't dilute your honey with water. If you dilute your honey with water, it risks fermentation. The reason honey has its extended shelf life beyond our lifetime is because there's so much sugar concentrated in it, and the water percentages are so low, below 18% most often, and it will not spoil. So don't add water to it. The next question I have, and we're going to talk about a couple of things on this question. So one of the things is, how much is honey worth to you? Because if you're like us, my wife handles the sales for honey, and she only does that direct, Here's your honey, here's your honey. So these are direct point of sale quarts of honey. A quart of honey is $20. Honey has value. Look at, you think about how much your bees work to make it, and of course, it's only natural. You would want to feed that back to them, right? But if you've got gallons of honey sitting around, that is a lot of value in the honey. In fact, when your bees go into winter, and if you're going to feed them their honey back to them, which you could do, it's stable through winter, and the whole thing is they have to come up underneath of it, and they would be warming the honey that they're in immediate contact with so that they could consume it. And of course, they need water, which is condensed from the inside of the hive from their own respiration and everything else, and the interior walls. They use that water to come in, and they use it to dissolve winter honey, and they warm it by having the cluster in intimate contact with it. So you could feed them honey. But the one thing is, you mentioned this Bee Smart Designs 3-season feeder. I have to talk about that. They've been through some different iterations. This one, for example, used to sit on the Bee Smart Designs Ultimate Cover. This sat on the outside of the hive, on top of their ultimate cover, and there was a hole. You pulled the plug off and you set this inside. I guarantee you no bees die from getting into this and drowning, because they can't. They have these little holes right here. But guess what happened? This sat up there. First of all, I didn't like it because it sat on top of the hive. It was exposed to the weather and the sunlight hit it. And over the years, the plastic broke down from exposure to sunlight. The other thing was this kind of mushroomed down a little bit and would express the syrup or the sugar syrup that you mix yourself down into the hive. And where was it? It was centered right over your inner cover, and your cluster of bees generally was right under it. Therefore, they got a soaking when the temperature extremes happen, as it does here, because we'll get mornings later in the year as we get into winter where it would be 29 degrees in the morning and then 65 by mid-afternoon. And then this expansion, depending on how much air was in here, as it warmed, it expressed more water, sugar syrup down onto the bees. But I have a solution, because you weren't mentioning this tank. You're mentioning the 3 seasons version. Okay, so we're going to talk about this too. These are 1-gallon tanks. And I did a lot of evaluating with this. In fact, if you Google Bee Smart Designs water drinkers, my videos are the first ones that come up. So I have some responsibility to talk about these things. And what you need to know is, especially when you do a heavy syrup, you can do it. But what happens with this feeder, this is now inside of a feeder shim, right? So a box. And of course now, because remember, the insulated inner covers are also coming from Bee Smart Designs. So this is going to sit over the center hole on this inside a medium frame. Because what kind of distance is there? From this inner surface right here to the outside of this, I wrote it on the side of this for reference, it's 6 inches. So you have to allow 6 inches of space to accommodate this tanker. But what happened was, especially with heavy stuff, let's talk about ProSweet. ProSweet is made by Mann Lake. I get nothing for mentioning them, by the way. I know people are always worried that I'm going to mention something that I'm getting a kickback or something for. But anyway, ProSweet from Mann Lake. If you put that in here, it has basically the same consistency of actual honey, right? So this stuff is heavy. You put a gallon of that in this tank, and what happened? You set this on. It has the middle spud here too that goes on that center, and then it would mushroom down a little bit. And again, I had leaking problems. This was dripping into, I put it on a couple of nucleus colonies that I was trying to kick off. I thought they needed it, and it was leaking out. So the thicker the syrup, the less leaking there is. But now the physical weight caused again. Now this is a stronger tank than they originally had. So this kind of compares the two. These are the two tanks. This one is stronger. It's made out of thicker plastic. It's all food grade stuff. But it still would bellows down. So here's what I do. If you look at the little feet that are on here, I've put wooden shims on either side. See this little wooden insert here? What that did was that pushed down the bottom piece here, the feeding surface, and it raised this tank a little bit and created a more contour towards the middle. Because the other thing is, when it mushroomed down, some of the syrup gathered around the edges of it, or if your hive is tilted, as most should be, tilted towards the landing board, especially in winter, then we had extra syrup over here that never got to the bees. So by putting these wooden shims here, we create a space and we remove the ability for this tank to bellows down and express syrup through the middle. So what I recommend, because you're going into winter, even though down here you're in southern Kentucky, this will work there also. But it also works in the northern area this time of year when a lot of people are trying to make up for hives that might not have enough resources to get them through winter. They're not storing enough. So if we're trying to get them a heavy syrup, so that's the highest sugar content, and also we have concerns about inverting your own sugar. So if you're taking sucrose, you're going to try to convert it into fructose and glucose and the digestible particles for the bees to deal with, then I recommend you buy it rather than make your own, because you risk cooking it wrong and providing some dangerous materials. So I don't ever do anything except mix sugar syrup. But you can now put the heavy syrup on here and it won't bellows down and it will be available to them. And then the bees go up that central column and they collect right up against this, and then they can lick away at it at the bottom here as they warm the syrup that's in direct contact with that spud. They don't warm the whole tank because it's above the hive, it's above the inner insulated cover, and probably very darn close to the outside temperatures. So ProSweet over honey. And why would I say that? Well, other studies have been done that show that your bees, if you feed them darker honey has more material in it, more minerals and stuff, which means that when your bees are digesting it, they have more waste material that they have to get rid of. And in order to do that, when it's cold outside, they need to fly out to eliminate. So the more material that's in that, besides the, fructose and glucose that has come from the original sucrose, then they have to defecate. They have to get out. So the clearer the resource for them, that's a pure carbohydrate to keep their energy levels up, the less they will have a need to go out and, of course, defecate, which means that if it's really cold outside and they can't fly, they're not going to be trapped inside with a whole bunch of waste material in their body that otherwise could help pollute the interior of the colony if they end up not being able to hold it, if they're also dealing with nosema and things like that that cause them to have dysentery. See what's happening is they get sick from that stuff. Their gut bacteria, we need to look out for it. So then the other part of it is economic. This is why commercial beekeepers, you see them, they buy these huge tanks of ProSweet and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this stuff is way expensive. But you do some very simple math here. A quart of honey here in Pennsylvania this year sells for $20. Now, sure, you can ask for a deposit for your jar or whatever, because the jar might be another 90 cents, and then your lid's another 20 cents for the reusable plastic lids, because these are canning jars, but the lids are reusable. We, sanitize them in the dishwasher. So you get your jars back, so we can take that out of the price equation, right? But if you're getting $20 a gallon, that's an $80 potential income for a gallon of honey. What does it cost for ProSweet? ProSweet, you get 2.5 gallons of ProSweet for $38. For that same 2.5 gallons of honey that you got from your bees, you would have gained $160. And they also sell ProSweet, 5 gallons, for $62.95. And I don't have to tell you, if you've got 5 gallons of honey that you're about to feed back to your bees, you're losing $400 in income. Think about it, 5 gallons of honey. So $400 you could have earned from one of your beehives that year. So if you're saving it, you're going to feed it back to your bees. This is what I'm suggesting, is that something like ProSweet would actually be better for the bees throughout the winter or the cold months. So it's a 3-season feeder. They don't call it a 4-season feeder. So when we really hit the freezing, you shouldn't be putting liquid in there anyway. So the late season buildup, if you're feeding it back to help them prepare for winter, then it looks pretty obvious that $62.95 for 5 gallons of ProSweet compared to the $400 you could have gained from the honey that you would be feeding back to them is not something I personally would do. So anyway, I also wanted to share that fix about the tank to keep it from mushrooming down. Shims in there the way I showed. And don't make your shims too thin because we don't want it to bend the wooden shims and things like that. But those are fixes. That's what I think. I hope I answered the question. Feedback on your hive in winter using inverted mason jar. Be smart. And of course, honey could be fed any time of the year, but it does get really cold, and the bees are only going to use the honey that they can warm up enough to consume, because they have to warm it, then consume it. They also add water to it, which is why the bees inside your hive need moisture. They need water in order to make use of heavy syrups and honey. Next we go to number 8, which is Gloria Nelson. When you've extracted your honey and run through the strainer, on the top you have a white foam. Is there a way to get rid of that, or better yet, not have it at all? As you bottle, it moves towards the bottom of the pail. The last jars have some white foam on top. Yeah, I'll show you what that is. Here's some foam on top right there. That's what we're talking about. So the foam accumulates on top in your bucket, but what the heck is that? Your honey includes something. It's an enzyme called glucose oxidase. It breaks down glucose sugars, and it generates wherever water comes in contact. So if you're in a hot honey house, for example, and there's condensation in the air and it's super humid in there, which it's likely to be, sometimes that condensation forms on the surface of your big vats of honey or your 5-gallon pails of honey, and some moisture accumulates up there. So this enzyme produces hydrogen peroxide at the surface, and that's what the white foamy bubbles is. Bubbles are, that is your honey defending itself from gaining water at the surface like that. So it's actually fighting it off, and it's also bleaching itself with hydrogen peroxide. So you can scrape that off and get rid of it. It doesn't hurt anything, but you can pour it off the top. You could scoop it with a spoon, and that's just water trying to enter your honey, and your honey defending itself from that water. So, oh look, my gosh, that was my last question for today. So I do want to talk to you about something. This is very important when you go out to inspect your hives right now. As I was just out there because I've condensed down my hives for wintertime already. So here we are in October. There are robbers out there, and they are intense. So we're dealing with yellow jackets, which are so crazed in their determination to get into the hives and get the honey. They're fighting on the landing boards. They're stinging the bees. They're being stung by the bees, and they're fighting it out. And also, the minute you pull a cover, an inner cover, you want to do an inspection or something like that, this time of year, you're going to have to move fast, because the microsecond that you break open any kind of honey and it gets exposed, that scent gets in the air, you've got bees that are foraging, that are attacking that hive immediately. Made a big mistake. One of the hives that I pulled off, I used one of those Ciracel plastic bee escapes. That plastic bee escape that I put on had a little dip in it because it's made out of plastic. And I've used the wooden bee escapes too. I had them all because I put them on all hives at the same time, pull all the honey at the same time, collapse everything down at the same time. That way all the hives are kind of on even footing. But as we discussed earlier today, a lot of these scout bees that are out, these foragers that are looking for these resources, are not from our apiary. Anyway, the opening through the middle, the gap was just enough, and I didn't catch it till the following day because I put bee escapes on one day. The following day, around the same time, is when I pull those upper boxes off, and then I pull the bee escape out, put the inner cover on, close everything down, and kind of do a quick account of what's going on in the colony for winter to make sure they have enough honey to get through. At least one full medium super is what they need where I live. So I noticed that that gap was just enough. Few bees got in there, and they were trying to rob it out. So what happened was I had a bee escape, the upper part of the bee escape, robbers were getting in, and then of course the resident bees stayed up in that upper box because they're trying to defend, and I had hundreds of dead bees in the front of the hive because robbers, once they're at the hive, attack from all points, and they attack the landing board, and they get so fever pitched in their desire to get as much honey as they can going into winter themselves that they don't even care that there's a fight to the death at the entrance because they hope to overwhelm the bees, get in, and rob them blind. Well, that colony held its own, no thanks to me. I pulled the escape board out and pulled the top box off, put the insulated inner cover on, put the outer cover on, closed everything up. There's no path for them to get in now except the entrance. And what size should the entrance be on a strong colony this time of year? I have them at 3 inches in width, and they are 3/8 in height. And that's because where I live, we have deer mice that try to get into the hives, and they can't fit through that opening. So it saves me from having to put on mouse guards and things like that. But the bees have great memories. So once they've gotten into something and gotten into the honey, expect them to continue to attack that resource for days, even though they can no longer get in. And you can spot your robber bees because they are at the lid, they're on the sides, they're at the back, they're checking underneath the hive, they're avoiding the main entrance if it's small enough and well defended, because this colony, thankfully, is very strong and healthy, and they're obviously killing the attacking bees. But of course, we're probably losing some of the resident bees too, because when I pulled that off and closed it up, there were robber bees trapped inside. So what's left to go in there? Some big melee, and then they're killing off all the non-resident bees that are in the hive, chucking them out the front. So, lesson learned. I don't have hives being robbed out this year because I got all over it and closed all the entrances up on every single hive, including the lay-ins, including the long Langstroth hive, all of the nucleus colonies that are double-deckers now. They're 10-frame nucleus. They have the rotating... I thought I had one in here. Anyway, they have the rotating covers on them. They only have the small hole on the front, so I have that blocked half. I would much rather see a traffic jam at the entrances this time of year than to have wasps and other robber bees gaining access to your hive. So reducing your entrance, causing a traffic jam, to me is a great trade-off to having them overwhelmed and robbed blind going into winter. So that's it for today. I want to thank you for being with me today, either through YouTube or by listening on Podbean. And I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and maybe we'll have some cool videos coming out next week that show the sugar dusting and the results of ongoing tests like that. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.